The Mafia boss chose his mistress over his curvy wife without a second thought. But his curvy wife had already found the one secret his mistress had been hiding for 8 years. The secret that was going to destroy him. The invitation arrived on a Tuesday. Gold lettering on black card, heavy, expensive, the kind of paper that whispered power before you even read the words. Isabella Romano turned it over in her hands, reading it twice, then a third time, as if the words might rearrange themselves into something kinder. The Venice Summit. A gathering of the 5 families. Spouses are expected to attend. She set it down on the kitchen table and went back to reviewing the shipping invoices spread across her desk. She already knew what was coming. She had known for weeks. Ever since she noticed Dante's calls getting shorter when she entered a room, ever since Veronica's name started appearing in his calendar with no explanation attached. She told herself she was prepared. She was wrong. Dante Romano announced it at dinner. Not privately, not gently, not the way a man speaks to his wife when he has something difficult to say. He announced it the way he announced everything. At the head of the long oak table, with 6 of his captains seated around him and 3 household staff within earshot, because Dante Romano had never once in his life considered who was listening. "Veronica will accompany me to Venice," he said, cutting into his lamb like the sentence meant nothing. "Isabella, you'll stay at the estate until I return." The table went quiet. Marco, his oldest captain, stared at his plate. The 2 younger men exchanged a glance they immediately regretted when Dante looked up. The household staff found reasons to move toward the far end of the room. Isabella did not look away from her husband. She held his gaze for exactly 3 seconds, long enough that he shifted in his chair, and then she picked up her wine glass, took one slow sip, and nodded once. "As you wish," she said. That was all. No scene, no tears. No raised voice to give him the drama he half expected and was fully prepared to dismiss. She simply stood, folded her napkin with the kind of precision that takes real effort to maintain, and excused herself from the table. She heard him exhale behind her. Relief, she thought. Or maybe disappointment. With Dante, those 2 feelings had always lived very close together. She did not cry until she reached the upstairs study, and even then, she allowed herself exactly 4 minutes. 4 minutes with the door locked, and her back pressed against it, and her hand covering her mouth, so no sound escaped into the hallway. Then she washed her face, sat down at her desk, and got back to work. This was the part nobody ever saw. This was the part Dante had never once bothered to notice. For 6 years, Isabella had quietly managed the financial architecture of the Romano estate. Not because anyone asked her to, but because someone had to, and the men Dante trusted with numbers were better at spending them than protecting them. She had built relationships with accountants in Palermo, with port managers in Catania, with legal advisors in Rome, who returned her calls because she actually understood what she was asking. Dante thought she spent her days managing the household. She spent her days managing everything else. She found the discrepancy by accident. She had been pulling together the quarterly shipping reports, a task she did every 3 months like clockwork, when a set of transfer authorizations slipped out from between 2 folders. She almost set them aside. Instead, something made her stop. The authorization codes were Dante's, his signature, his department codes, his approval stamps. But the transfers themselves, 17 of them, spread across 8 months, were moving money she had never once seen accounted for. Not into Romano operations, not into any account she recognized. Into a series of numbered entities with no names, no addresses, and no paper trail she could follow past the first step. She sat very still for a long time. The numbers were not small. Added together, they represented more than she wanted to calculate without checking twice. She checked twice, then she checked again. 43 million euros, gone, and every transaction stamped with her husband's name. Her first instinct, she hated herself for it, was to protect him. Not because he deserved it, He had just humiliated her in front of his captains and chosen his mistress over his wife in the same breath he used to order lamb. He did not deserve her protection. But because she understood immediately, with the cold clarity of a woman who had spent 6 years reading between the lines of documents, no one thought she was smart enough to understand that this was not Dante stealing from himself. This was someone stealing through him. And when it was discovered, when the other families eventually noticed, the signature on every transaction would be his. He would not lose money. He would lose everything: his territory, his alliances, his standing, his life. Isabella pressed her fingertips together and looked out at the darkened Sicilian countryside. The olive trees were silver in the moonlight. The estate was silent. Somewhere inside this house, her husband was probably already on the phone with Veronica, laughing about something, completely unaware that someone had spent the better part of a year building a trap with his name written on it. She thought about walking downstairs and telling him. She thought about what he would say, whether he would believe her, whether he would thank her or dismiss her the same way he had dismissed her at dinner. Politely, efficiently, without a second thought. She thought about Veronica sitting beside him in Venice wearing something expensive, smiling at men who mattered, while Isabella waited at the estate like furniture between uses. Then she closed the folders, stacked them neatly, and locked them in the bottom drawer of her desk. She was not going to tell him, not yet. First, she was going to find out exactly what was happening, exactly who was behind it, and exactly how deep it went. And she was going to do it alone. Because the one thing 6 years of being underestimated had given her was this: nobody was watching her. For the first time in her marriage, that felt less like a wound and more like a weapon. She opened her laptop, pulled up the contact list she kept encrypted under a folder labeled household accounts, and began making calls. Nobody notices the woman who keeps the books. That was something Isabella had understood long before she married Dante Romano. In the world of powerful men, the woman who managed numbers was invisible, not because she lacked intelligence, but because intelligence in a quiet woman was consistently mistaken for obedience. Men shook Dante's hand at dinner parties and looked through Isabella like she was decorative glass. They talked freely around her. They left documents on tables she sat beside. They made phone calls in rooms where she was already sitting because they had simply forgotten she was there. For 6 years, that invisibility had felt like humiliation. Now it felt like the most dangerous advantage in Sicily. She left the estate at 7 the next morning. No announcement, no explanation to the staff beyond a brief note saying she was conducting routine audits of company assets in Palermo. The kind of errand so mundane that nobody would think to question it or think to mention it to Dante, who was already on a train to Venice with Veronica's luggage occupying the space where Isabella's should have been. She drove herself. That was the first decision. No driver meant no report back to the estate, no eyes watching which streets she turned down, no polite loyalty that would eventually find its way to Dante's ear. The road from the estate to Palermo took 90 minutes. Isabella spent them thinking. She had 3 names from the transfer documents. Not the names of the shell companies. Those were meaningless, designed to be meaningless. But 3 authorization contacts whose codes appeared repeatedly across the transactions. Codes that should have belonged to internal Romano accountants. Codes she recognized because she had personally helped restructure the department numbering system 2 years ago at Dante's request when his actual accountants had proven spectacularly useless at basic compliance. He had thanked her by asking what was for dinner. She had thanked herself by quietly memorizing every code in the new system. The first name was Fausto Greco, 61 years old, senior accounts manager for Romano Shipping, based in Palermo for 11 years. A quiet man who smelled like cigarettes and wore the same brown jacket to every meeting. Isabella had met him perhaps a dozen times. He had never once looked directly at her. She found him at his office above a dry goods warehouse near the port. He looked up when she walked in, and for one brief moment, something moved across his face that was not surprise. It was fear. He recovered quickly, offered her coffee, made small talk about the weather with the specific desperation of a man buying time. Isabella accepted the coffee, sat down, and placed a single sheet of paper on his desk. One of the transfer records printed cleanly, with 3 authorization codes circled in red. "I'm updating the internal audit records," she said pleasantly. "I just need you to confirm which department authorized these transfers." The silence that followed told her everything. Fausto Greco was not a criminal mastermind. He was a frightened, middle-aged man who had been asked to press a stamp on documents he was told not to read, and paid enough to convince himself that ignorance was the same as innocence. Under 20 minutes of calm, patient questioning. The kind of questioning that never raised its voice because it never needed to. He gave her 2 things. A name of a shipping contact in Catania who had handled the actual movement of funds, and a warning. "Signora Romano." He leaned forward, his voice dropping to almost nothing. "I don't know what you're looking for, but whatever it is, stop. There are people involved in this who don't solve problems the way your husband solves problems." Isabella smiled at him the same way she had smiled at Dante across the dinner table the night before. Calm, steady, giving nothing away. "Thank you for the coffee, Fausto." Catania was a 3-hour drive east, through the kind of Sicilian countryside that looked peaceful in a way that had always struck Isabella as slightly dishonest. She arrived by early afternoon and found the shipping contact, a nervous young man named Enzo, at a harborside office that smelled like diesel and salt. Enzo was less composed than Fausto. He took one look at the documents she laid on the table and started sweating through his collar. He told her about 4 shell companies operating out of port addresses that existed on paper and nowhere else. He told her the money moved through legitimate shipping manifests, cargo that was logged, inspected, and cleared because the men behind the operation had someone inside the inspection chain. Then he told her something that made her stop writing. "The companies," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "are all registered to the same holding group, out of Venice." Isabella kept her pen moving so he wouldn't see her hand still. Venice, where Dante was right now, where every major family had gathered, where someone had arranged to have the most powerful mafia bosses in Italy in one room, while simultaneously holding 43 million reasons to destroy the man whose name was on every stolen transaction. The timing wasn't coincidence. The summit itself was part of the plan. She was back in her car within 4 minutes, already dialing the one accountant she trusted completely, a retired forensic analyst in Catania named Sal, who owed her 3 favors and had never once asked why. What she didn't notice, pulling out of the harbor, was the dark blue sedan that pulled out exactly 6 seconds behind her. Sal Benedetti lived above a tobacco shop on a narrow street that smelled like espresso and old stone. He was 70 years old, half-retired, and sharper than any man Isabella had ever met who actually wanted you to know how sharp he was. Saul had no interest in impressing anyone. He wore slippers indoors until noon, kept his financial records in a system only he understood, and had once told Isabella that the most dangerous document in the world was a clean balance sheet. She had remembered that ever since. He looked at the files she spread across his kitchen table and said nothing for 11 minutes. Isabella counted. She had learned early that interrupting Sal's silence was the fastest way to get less information. So she sat with her coffee and let him work. Finally, he looked up. "These aren't Romano funds," he said. "I know. Someone is moving them to look like they are." "No." He tapped the paper. "I mean the original source. This money didn't start inside Romano operations. It was introduced from outside and moved through his accounts. Whoever did this wasn't stealing from your husband, Isabella." He paused. "They were laundering through him and building a record that makes him look like the architect." The room felt smaller suddenly. How long would it take investigators to reach that conclusion? Sal tilted his head. Experienced ones? A week. Maybe less if someone pointed them in the right direction. He looked at her carefully. Someone is going to point them. She left Sal's apartment with a name he'd extracted from the holding company registration, buried 4 layers deep in the documents. A name, attached to a legal address in Catania's commercial district. Luca Amari, listed as a financial consultant. Sal had gone pale when he saw it. I know this man, he said quietly. He testified in the Messina proceedings 3 years ago. Prosecution witness. He helped dismantle the Conti family from the inside. He looked at Isabella. He doesn't work for himself. He works for whoever hires him to dismantle people. Isabella wrote the address down and didn't tell Sal where she was going next. The warehouse sat at the edge of Catania's southern harbor, the old section where the loading cranes hadn't moved in 20 years, and the buildings wore their age badly. She found it without difficulty, which should have been her first warning. Addresses this clean in documents, this dirty were either traps or mistakes, and Luca Amari did not strike her as a man who made mistakes. He was already inside when she arrived. A small man, late 50s, with careful eyes and the particular stillness of someone accustomed to being in rooms where violence was possible. He had a leather briefcase open on a crate beside him and a flash drive in his hand. He had clearly been expecting someone. Whether that someone was Isabella was harder to read. You're Romano's wife, he said. Not a question. You've been using my husband's authorization codes to move money that will eventually destroy him, she replied. Also not a question. Something shifted in his expression, not quite respect, but its practical equivalent. Sit down, he said. There's more here than you've found. I was going to disappear with this. He held up the drive. But if you're already this far along, you deserve to know what you're actually dealing with. He began talking. He had been embedded inside the operation for 8 months, he said, not as an architect but as an auditor brought in to verify the laundering was holding. What he'd discovered had changed his mind about leaving quietly. The conspiracy was larger than financial fraud. There was a secondary phase, documented, scheduled, and already partially in motion, that involved triggering a war between 3 of the 5 families by releasing fabricated evidence of territorial violations, all traceable back to Dante Romano. They don't want his money, Amari said. They want the chaos his destruction creates. 6 territories go unstable simultaneously, and someone walks in and picks them up during the fighting. Isabella opened her mouth to ask who. The first shot came through the corrugated wall to her left. The second shattered the single bulb overhead. Darkness, immediate and total. She heard Amari move, a grunt, a stumble, the sound of the briefcase hitting concrete. And then a sound she recognized with a cold precision she wished she didn't possess. The specific silence of a man who has stopped moving permanently. She dropped low and ran on instinct, the way she had once run through the back fields of her village as a girl when the older boys thought cruelty was entertainment. Low, fast, no hesitation about direction. She hit the dock door with her shoulder, burst through it, and the harbor smell hit her like a wall. Diesel and salt and cold night air. To her right, the warehouse entrance. To her left, a 30-foot drop into black water where a fishing vessel was pulling away from the dock. Engine already running. She jumped. The cold nearly stopped her heart. She grabbed the vessel's rope ladder with both hands and held on while the boat moved into open water, and the sound of boots on the dock behind her grew distant, then disappeared. She was soaked, shaking. Amari was dead. But in her jacket pocket, her fingers found something he had pressed into her hand in the darkness before the shooting started. The flash drive. And written on it in small letters barely visible, one name, Veronica. Venice in November wore its beauty like a warning. The water was gray-green and cold, the palazzos rising from it like they had always been there and always would be, indifferent to everything that happened inside them. Isabella had been to Venice once before, on her honeymoon with Dante, when he had still bothered to pretend that her presence mattered to him. She remembered thinking then that the city felt like a place where secrets had nowhere to go except deeper. She understood that better now. She arrived by private water taxi at 7 in the morning, still wearing borrowed clothes from the fishing vessel's crew. A heavy wool sweater too, sizes too large and trousers held up by a length of rope. She had spent 4 hours on that boat, cold and thinking, watching the coastline slide past in darkness, while she worked through everything Amari had told her before he died. She had one advantage the people trying to stop her didn't know she had. The flash drive. She had accessed it on the boat captain's ancient laptop, a man named Oreo, who asked no questions and accepted 40 euros and a promise she intended to keep. The drive contained partial transaction records, yes, but more importantly it contained something Amari had clearly been assembling for his own protection. A chain of communications between shell company directors that referenced the Venice summit explicitly. Dates, planned outcomes, and a recurring contact identifier that appeared in 14 separate messages. A contact identified only as V. She didn't need Amari to tell her who V was. She already knew. What she needed was a room full of witnesses. She spent 3 hours in a small hotel near the Rialto that accepted cash, changed into the one outfit she had carried in her travel bag. A deep burgundy dress, understated, elegant, the kind of thing that said I belong here without trying too hard, and then sat at the small desk and made her final preparations. She printed what she needed at the hotel's business center, organized it, thought carefully about order and sequence, and exactly which document needed to land in front of which man first, the way she had once organized Dante's financial disclosures for an external audit and watched 3 separate lawyers fail to find a single error. Then she walked to the Palazzo Morosini, where the summit was already underway, and told the man at the door that she was Isabella Romano and that she would be going inside now. He checked his list. Her name was not on it. Check again, she said pleasantly. He made a phone call instead. She waited. 2 minutes later, a senior captain she recognized from Dante's inner circle appeared at the entrance and stared at her with an expression that moved rapidly through surprise, confusion, and something close to panic. Signora Romano. Thank you, she said and walked past him. The main hall was everything Venice promised and more. Vaulted ceilings, candlelight, the particular atmosphere of old money and older danger that only gathered in rooms like this one. 40 men, perhaps more, distributed across the space in the careful geometry of people who trusted each other just enough to be in the same building. And there, at the center of the room, was Dante. He stood with the ease of a man who had never once doubted his right to occupy space, broad-shouldered, beautifully dressed, holding a crystal glass, and laughing at something the man beside him had said. And on his arm, her hand resting against his sleeve with practiced familiarity, was Veronica. She was stunning. Isabella had always known that, the way you know about a storm before it arrives, abstractly, at a safe distance. Up close, the reality of it landed differently. Tall, dark-haired, wearing something silver that caught the candlelight, she looked exactly like what Dante had always wanted standing beside him, a reflection of the version of himself he was most desperate to project. Isabella watched them for exactly 4 seconds. Then she crossed the room. The silence spread outward from her like a stone dropped in still water. One conversation stopping, then another, until by the time she reached the center of the hall, the entire room had gone quiet in the particular way that rooms go quiet when something is happening that everyone will remember. Dante saw her. The glass stopped halfway to his mouth. To his credit, or perhaps to the credit of 30 years of conditioning, his face revealed almost nothing, just the briefest tightening around the eyes, a micro-expression she had learned to read years ago. Shock, rapidly suppressed. Veronica's hand tightened on his arm. Isabella did not look at either of them for long. Instead, she turned, with the calm of someone who had rehearsed this moment on a fishing boat in the Adriatic, and addressed the room. "Gentlemen, I apologize for the interruption." She reached into the leather folder under her arm and began placing documents on the nearest table, organized, clearly labeled exactly as she had prepared them. "My name is Isabella Romano. In the last 72 hours, I've uncovered evidence that 43 million euros have been systematically moved through Romano family accounts by an external operation designed to frame my husband." She paused. "Many of those accounts intersect with your own." The silence changed quality entirely. It was no longer the silence of surprise. It was the silence of men doing rapid private calculations. "I'd like 15 minutes, Isabella said. "After that, you can decide what to do with what I've shown you." From across the room, she finally let herself look at Dante. He was staring at her like he had never seen her before. He hadn't. Not really. Neither had Veronica. But her expression was something different entirely. It wasn't shock, it was calculation. The 15 minutes Isabella asked for turned into 2 hours. Not because the men in that room were generous with their time. They weren't. These were men who measured trust in decades and information in leverage. But because the documents she placed on that table were too precise to dismiss and too dangerous to ignore. 3 separate family accountants were pulled from dinner tables to examine the records on the spot. All 3 reached the same conclusion within 40 minutes. The money was real, the trail was real, and the exposure was real. What Isabella didn't show them, not yet, was the flash drive that she kept in her pocket like a held card because she had learned something important in the last 72 hours. Information released too early was just noise. Information released at the right moment was a verdict. Dante said nothing through all of it. He stood at the edge of the room with his arms crossed and his jaw set, watching her work, and she could feel his gaze the entire time. Heavy, complicated. A man trying to solve an equation he didn't have all the variables for. Veronica had detached herself from his arm within minutes of Isabella's arrival, drifting to the far end of the hall with the practiced grace of someone repositioning without appearing to retreat. Isabella noticed. She noticed everything. When the room finally thinned, family heads stepping away to make private calls, captains clustering in corners, Dante crossed to where she stood. He stopped 2 feet away, close enough that she could see the tension in his face that he hadn't quite managed to suppress. "You shouldn't be here," he said. "You're welcome," she replied. His jaw tightened. "The accounts have been compromised for 8 months, Dante. Possibly longer." She kept her voice low and completely even. "Someone has been building a case against you using your own authorization codes. By the time it was discovered through normal channels, every signature on every transaction would point directly at you." She paused. "I found it 3 days ago. Hidden between quarterly shipping reports you've never once looked at. The silence between them was different from the one in the hall. This one had history in it." "Why didn't you tell me immediately?" he asked. She looked at him steadily. "Would you have listened?" He didn't answer. They both knew why. She picked up her folder. "An elderly gentleman would like to speak with you. Don't dismiss what he says." She walked away before he could respond, which she suspected was the first time in their marriage she had done exactly that. The elderly man's name was Don Cesare Altieri, 81 years old, head of the oldest family at the table, a man so far beyond the need to perform authority that he simply existed inside it, way mountains exist inside landscapes. He had watched Isabella's presentation from a chair near the window without expression, and afterward had requested privately that Dante come to him. Isabella learned what was said in that conversation secondhand through a captain named Marco, who had been present and who, she was discovering, had a quietly guilty conscience about the dinner 3 nights ago in Sicily. Don Cesare had told Dante 2 things. First, that he had seen this pattern before. The laundering, the framing, the carefully timed exposure, and the family it had been used against 20 years ago no longer existed. Second, that the woman who had just stood in front of 40 hostile men with borrowed documents and no backup deserved considerably more than she was apparently receiving. Dante had said nothing in response. Don Cesare had apparently considered that answer sufficient. Isabella left Venice that night, not because she had been defeated. The room's reaction had confirmed that her evidence was credible, and that several powerful men were now deeply motivated to investigate further. But because she had one lead that required immediate and private pursuit, and Venice was not the place to pursue it. The flash drive communications referenced a private banking contact in Zurich, a specific branch, a specific account manager whose name appeared in 3 separate messages from V to the Shell Company directors. She was on a morning flight to Switzerland before Dante had finished his breakfast. Zurich in November was precise and cold and utterly indifferent, which suited Isabella perfectly. The bank was in the old quarter, understated exterior, devastating interior, the kind of institution that communicated its importance entirely through what it refused to display. She had spent the flight preparing, using Sal's name and 3 years of legitimately established Romano financial credentials to arrange a consultation under the pretext of reviewing Romano estate holdings managed through Swiss instruments. The account manager was a thin, careful man named Hoffman who wore his discretion like a second suit. He didn't give her what she needed willingly. He gave it to her because she already knew enough that refusing became more dangerous than confirming, and because she placed 3 documents in front of him that demonstrated she had legal standing to request disclosure on Romano-linked accounts. What she found inside those records stopped her breathing for a full 3 seconds. The Shell companies didn't belong to a rival family. They belonged to a syndicate, not Sicilian, not even Italian, that had been operating across 4 countries for 11 years, specializing in exactly this: the systematic destruction of established criminal empires through financial warfare, followed by territorial acquisition during the power vacuum. They had done it before, 3 times, in Naples, in Marseille, in Barcelona. Each time, the empire they targeted had been brought down not by violence but by paperwork, by evidence so carefully constructed that it destroyed credibility before a single shot was fired. And each time, the operation had used the same internal mechanism. A person close to the target, someone trusted, someone with access. Isabella sat very still and looked at the transaction records. Hoffman had reluctantly produced and followed the authorization chain back to its origin point with the slow, terrible focus of someone who already suspects what they're going to find, but needs to see it written down before they can believe it. The origin account, the one that had introduced the money, established the Shell structure, and maintained communication with the syndicate's directors for 11 months. It was registered to a woman. The account was 8 years old. It predated Isabella's marriage to Dante by 2 years. Veronica had not become Dante's mistress and then been recruited. She had been recruited first. Everything else, the relationship, the influence, the careful positioning beside the most powerful man in Sicily, had been the operation. All of it. From the beginning. Isabella closed the folder, thanked Hoffman in a voice that revealed nothing, and walked out into the cold Zurich street. She stood there for a moment, breathing carefully. Then she called Marco. "Tell Dante," she said quietly, "that his mistress has been working against him for 8 years, and tell him I have the proof." She hung up before he could respond. Somewhere behind her, a car door opened. She didn't hear it in time. She woke up in the back of a moving vehicle. Not slowly, the way you wake from sleep, but all at once. Awareness arriving like a door kicked open, sharp and disorienting. Her wrists were bound behind her with the kind of restraint that didn't cut, but held absolutely. A blindfold, the smell of leather seats and pine forest and something chemical that explained the gap between the Zurich street and this moment. She made herself stay still. This was the first decision, and it mattered. Panic was information given freely to people who hadn't earned it. She breathed through her nose, counted the sounds available to her. 2 men in the front, one of them driving, neither speaking, and estimated speed and road surface and the particular quality of silence that meant they were no longer in a city. Mountains, she thought. The road had the rhythm of elevation. She had been unconscious for somewhere between 1 and 3 hours. Long enough to be far from Zurich. Not long enough to be anywhere that required an airport. Austrian Alps. That was her best calculation. She filed it and stayed still and waited. The vehicle stopped. She was walked, not roughly, which told her something, through what sounded like gravel, then stone floors, then stone again. Cold air, high altitude, the particular acoustics of thick walls that had been standing for centuries. When the blindfold came off, she was sitting in a chair in a room that might once have been a library. Bookshelves stripped bare, a single window showing nothing but dark mountainside and a sliver of pewter sky. A fire burning in a stone fireplace, more for atmosphere than warmth, she suspected, because the room was still cold. Across from her, seated behind a heavy oak desk, was a man she had never seen before. He looked like someone's retired grandfather, 70 perhaps older, silver-haired, slim, with the kind of unremarkable face that belonged in garden centers and Sunday markets. Pale eyes behind small glasses. Hands folded on the desk with the patience of a man who had spent a lifetime waiting for things he had arranged to happen. "Signora Romano," he said, in accented Italian. "I apologize for the method of invitation. Please understand it was practical rather than personal." Isabella looked at him evenly. "Who are you?" "My name is unimportant." He said it the way people say things that are entirely important. "What matters is that you have spent the last several days dismantling something that took 11 years to build. And I'd like to understand how." "Curiosity," she said. "I'm a very thorough bookkeeper." Something moved in his pale eyes, not quite amusement. "Yes, that was our miscalculation." He unfolded his hands. "We accounted for your husband. We accounted for his captains, his lawyers, his allies. We did not account for his wife." A pause. "Nobody did. People rarely do." "No," he agreed, "they don't." He said it without apology, which she found almost refreshing. The operation in Sicily was 11 years in construction. Veronica's placement alone required 3 years of preparation before she ever met your husband. The financial architecture took another 4. By the time we moved into the active phase, every element was in position. He tilted his head slightly. "You found it in 72 hours. "I found it because I knew the accounts," Isabella said. "I knew them because nobody thought it was worth preventing me from knowing them." He nodded slowly. "A structural flaw," noted. "The casual professionalism of it," noted, as if she were providing feedback on a business process, told her everything about who this man was. He wasn't angry. He wasn't threatened. He was, she realized with a cold clarity, genuinely curious, which meant he hadn't decided yet what to do with her. That was the only space she had. She needed to keep him talking. "The summit," she said. "The timing wasn't coincidental. No, the summit was the stage. Once the evidence was released through the appropriate channels, we had contacts in 2 regulatory bodies and 1 federal prosecutor's office. Your husband would have been arrested within 48 hours of the summit's conclusion, in front of every family he'd spent 30 years building alliances with." He paused. "The humiliation would have been total. The territorial claims would have collapsed. The resulting conflict between the remaining families would have created 6 months of instability, during which you moved in, during which we consolidated." He corrected the word with precision. "We don't fight for territory, Signora Romano. We simply ensure we're the only stable option remaining when the fighting stops." Isabella looked at the fire, kept her breathing even. "You've done this before. Marseille, Barcelona." He said them the way someone lists completed projects. Sicily was to be the 4th. "Was," she said. "Was," he agreed. He looked at her with those pale, evaluating eyes. "You understand that you cannot leave with what you know." I understand that you believe that, she said. He studied her for a moment. You're not afraid. I'm very afraid, she said honestly. So I'm simply more afraid of what happens if I stop thinking clearly than I am of you. Something shifted almost imperceptibly in his expression. He stood, moved to the window, and looked out at the darkened mountain. Your husband is looking for you, he said. It sounded like information rather than comfort. He won't find me. No, he said. Probably not. He turned back. Which makes this simpler. He nodded to someone behind her. Isabella closed her eyes for 1 second, not in fear, but in the way you close your eyes before something difficult to gather everything available to you. And then opened them again. She had left a trail. Deliberately, carefully, beginning in Zurich the moment she felt the car door open behind her. A message sent to Marco in the 2 seconds before the chemical smell reached her. 3 words, the coordinates from her phone's last known location, and 1 instruction. Tell Dante now. Whether he came was another question entirely. Whether he came in time was something she refused to calculate. Dante Romano had not slept in 31 hours. This was not unusual for a man in his position. Sleeplessness was practically a professional requirement. But the quality of this particular wakefulness was different from anything he had experienced before. It wasn't the sharp alertness of threat or the grinding exhaustion of crisis management. It was something quieter and considerably more uncomfortable. It was guilt. He sat in the back of an armored car, moving through Austrian darkness with Marco beside him, and 4 of his best men following in a second vehicle, and he looked at the 3 words Isabella had sent. Tell Dante, now. And he thought about the dinner table in Sicily. He thought about the way she had folded her napkin. He had spent 20 years in a world where weakness was the most dangerous thing a man could display, and somewhere in those 20 years he had confused cruelty with strength so completely that he no longer noticed the difference. He had looked at a woman who managed his empire from a desk nobody knew about, and read financial documents nobody thought she understood, and built relationships nobody thought to trace. And what he had seen was someone quiet and unimpressive who made him feel, beside the polished glamour of Veronica, embarrassingly ordinary. He had been protecting the wrong thing. He understood that now with the particular clarity that only arrives when something is nearly gone. She sent the coordinates from Zurich, Marco said quietly, but she'd already been moved by the time I received it. The phone pinged twice more, moving northeast, then nothing. He paused. Sal Benedetti in Catania cross-referenced the movement pattern with property records. There are 11 registered private estates in the Austrian Alps within that radius, and 9 are occupied by verifiable owners. 1 is under renovation. 1 was purchased 18 months ago through a Luxembourg holding company that doesn't exist anymore. Marco looked at him. It took Sal 4 hours to find it. It took Isabella 3 days to dismantle 11 years of work, Dante said quietly. Marco said nothing. He had learned over 30 years that there were moments when Dante Romano needed to reach conclusions without assistance. This was one of them. They found the fortress at 2 in the morning. Found was generous. It announced itself against the mountain like something that had decided long ago. It didn't need to hide. Stone walls, 3 stories, the kind of architecture that communicated permanence as a form of intimidation. 2 vehicles at the entrance, lights on the upper level. 2 guards visible from the tree line, with the particular stillness of professional men who believed themselves adequately covered. Dante's team moved into position without needing instruction. These were men who had operated together for years, who communicated in gestures and eye contact, and the specific silence of practiced coordination. Dante moved with them, which Marco had argued against twice on the drive and abandoned after Dante looked at him in a way that ended discussions. The approach took 20 minutes. Careful, low, using the mountain terrain the way men used it who had grown up where mountains were the safest place to be. They were 30 meters from the eastern wall when Isabella saved his life. He didn't see it coming. That was the precise and humbling truth of it. He, Dante Romano, with 30 years of operational experience and every advantage of preparation, did not see what she saw from an upper window of the building she was being held inside. A figure repositioning in the shadows to his left, moving with the unhurried patience of someone who had been waiting and had finally found their moment. The angle was wrong for any of Dante's team to catch it. But Isabella, watching from the window because she had never once stopped looking for information even while held captive in a mountain fortress, saw it immediately. She did the only thing available to her. She put her bound wrists through the window latch and pulled it open with enough force that the old iron mechanism struck the stone wall with a crack that rang out across the mountainside like a gunshot. Every head turned, including the figure in the shadows, which gave Marco exactly enough time to see him. The next 4 minutes were the kind that compress and expand simultaneously. Dante experienced them as both very fast and strangely detailed. The eastern wall, the guards responding to the wrong threat first. His men moving through the gap with the efficiency of people who had prepared for exactly this shape of chaos. Stone corridors, a staircase, voices, and then a door, and behind it Isabella. She was seated. Her wrists were raw from the restraints, and there was a bruise developing along her left cheekbone that he had to work to look away from, because looking at it did something to his chest that he didn't have vocabulary for yet. She looked at him with an expression that contained approximately 17 things at once, chief among them the particular exhaustion of someone who has been operating alone at full capacity for too long. "You came," she said. "You left coordinates," he replied. "I wasn't sure you'd follow them." He crossed the room, produced a knife, and cut the restraint from her wrists in one motion. Then he did something he could not entirely explain. He kept his hands around hers for a moment, longer than was necessary, looking at the marks the binding had left, and something in his jaw moved. "Isabella." "Not here," she said quietly. "Get me out first. Then we talk." They moved through the fortress fast and efficiently, Isabella between Dante and Marco, descending 2 flights before emerging into cold mountain air that she pulled into her lungs like it was something she had earned. At the tree line, while his men secured the perimeter and the silver-haired man was detained with the quiet competence of people who had done this before, Dante stopped walking. Isabella stopped beside him. The mountain was dark and enormous around them, indifferent as mountains always are, and the silence was the kind that made honesty feel less difficult than it did in rooms with furniture and history. "I treated you like you were invisible," he said. "Not an explanation, just a fact stated plainly, for years. And you spent those years building something that just saved my life and my empire, and I didn't know because I never once thought to look." Isabella was quiet for a moment. "You looked at me and saw what I wasn't," she said, "not what I was." "Yes, that's not a small thing, Dante. I know." She turned and looked at him directly, the same way she had looked at him across the dinner table in Sicily. Steady, clear-eyed, giving nothing away that she hadn't decided to give. "Knowing isn't enough," she said. "I've watched you know things for 6 years and do nothing with the knowledge." He didn't argue. There was nothing to argue. "Then tell me what is enough," he said, "and I'll do it." She studied him for a long moment in the dark. "Let's start," she said finally, "with Rome." Rome in December was cold and beautiful and completely unforgiving. Which made it, Isabella thought, the perfect location for what was about to happen. The emergency meeting had been called by Don Cesare Altieri, the only man in the 5 families, whose age and reputation placed him beyond suspicion and above argument. When Don Cesare summoned, people came. Not out of fear, exactly, but out of the particular respect reserved for men who had outlived every enemy they had ever made, and several they hadn't. The venue was a private dining hall in Trastevere, vaulted ceilings, long tables, the kind of room that had held difficult conversations for 3 centuries and showed no signs of strain. 12 family representatives, 8 senior captains. 4 men whose official titles were perfectly legal, and whose actual functions were considerably less so. And Veronica, who arrived believing she was attending a damage control meeting arranged by allies, who had assured her that Isabella's evidence was insufficient, circumstantial, and easily managed. She walked in wearing a black dress and absolute composure. She walked in alone, because Dante had quietly ensured that the men who were supposed to accompany her were delayed by a series of minor logistical problems that Marco had arranged with considerable satisfaction. Isabella watched her enter from a side room and felt nothing that surprised her. Not anger, not satisfaction, not the complicated grief of a woman confronting the person her husband had chosen over her. What she felt was simpler and more useful: focus. Dante entered the hall 5 minutes after Veronica. The room's reaction was immediate and revealing. The relief on some faces, the calculation on others, and on Veronica's face, for just a fraction of a second before her composure reassembled itself. Something that looked very much like fear. He crossed the room without looking at her and took his position at the head of the central table. Then he looked toward the side door. Isabella walked in. She had dressed carefully, not to impress. She was beyond performing for rooms like this one, but to communicate. Dark navy. Simple. The kind of clothing that said, "I am here to work," rather than "I am here to be seen." She carried a leather portfolio and a portable projector. She had spent the previous night preparing with a forensic accountant Dante had flown in from Milan. The room watched her cross to the table. Don Cesare, seated at the far end, inclined his head slightly. She returned the gesture. Veronica watched all of this with the expression of someone recalculating rapidly. Isabella didn't speak immediately. She set up the projector, organized her documents. Let the silence do its work. Because silence in a room full of powerful people was its own form of pressure. It made them aware of what they didn't know yet, and awareness of ignorance was deeply uncomfortable for men accustomed to controlling information. Then she began. She started not with Veronica. She started with the syndicate, its history, its methodology, its 3 previous operations in Naples, Marseille, and Barcelona. She showed the pattern clearly: financial infiltration, internal placement of an asset, manufactured evidence, timed exposure, territorial acquisition. She showed how each targeted family had been destroyed, not through warfare but through reputation, made to look criminal to other criminals, which in this world was the most complete form of destruction possible. She watched understanding move through the room like weather. Then she moved to Sicily, the shell companies, the authorization codes, the 43 million in laundered funds moving through Romano accounts, the regulatory contacts, and the federal prosecutor, who had been positioned to receive the evidence package within 48 hours of the Venice summit's conclusion. She showed all of it. 11 months of construction, dismantled document by document, laid out on a table in Trastevere, with the calm precision of a woman who had been underestimated so consistently that she had learned to use it like a tool. Then she placed the final document on the table, the account records from Zurich. This account, she said, was opened 8 years ago, 2 years before Dante Romano met the woman currently seated in this room. It received operational funding from the syndicate on a quarterly basis for the entire duration. Every significant communication between the syndicate's directors and their internal asset was routed through this account. She paused. The account belongs to Veronica Caruso, born not in Milan, as she has stated, but in a city outside Marseille, where the syndicate's second operation concluded 7 years ago. The room went very still. Veronica stood. "This is fabricated," she began. "Sit down." Don Cesare's voice was quiet. It was the quietness of something that didn't need volume. Veronica sat. Isabella continued without looking at her. "The syndicate's leader is currently in Austrian custody. His testimony regarding the internal asset's identity has already been provided to 2 separate judicial authorities and will be formally submitted within 72 hours. She closed the portfolio. The operation is finished. The evidence has been distributed to channels that cannot be recalled or suppressed. What happens next is your collective decision. She stepped back. What followed was not dramatic in the cinematic sense. There were no raised voices, no drawn weapons, no theatrical confrontation. What happened was quieter and considerably more final. The specific silence of a room reaching consensus without needing to articulate it, the way rooms like this one had always operated. Veronica's allies, 3 men who had positioned themselves near the door with the careful casualness of people planning exits, found those exits blocked by Dante's captains, who had been placed there an hour before the meeting began. The information Isabella had prepared for the regulatory contacts, and the federal prosecutor was released through carefully arranged channels that evening. By morning, the syndicate's financial infrastructure across 4 countries had been frozen. By the following afternoon, arrests had begun. Veronica was taken into custody in Rome, quietly, without spectacle, which was the detail that Isabella had specifically requested. She had no interest in theater. She had never had any interest in theater. She was standing in the corridor outside the dining hall, breathing the cold Trastevere air through a window left open, when Dante found her. He stood beside her without speaking for a moment. "It's done," he said finally. "Yes. You planned that entire presentation while being held in a mountain fortress." "I had time to think," she said. "Nobody was talking to me." He was quiet for a moment. Then something moved in his expression that she hadn't seen there before, or perhaps had seen once, very early, before 6 years of marriage had buried it under appearances and performance, and the relentless work of being the man he thought he needed to be. "Isabella." He turned to look at her directly.
"I don't know how,"
she said, not unkindly. "Words right now are easy. You've always been good with words." He accepted that without argument. "Then tell me what isn't easy," he said. She looked at him for a long moment. This man she had married and managed and quietly saved, this man who had humiliated her at a dinner table and chosen appearances over loyalty, and still, despite everything, come through a mountain in the dark when she sent 3 words and a coordinate. "Go home," she said, "and show me." 6 months is both a long time and no time at all. It is long enough for wounds to stop bleeding, not always long enough for them to stop aching. Isabella understood this distinction better than most, because she had spent the better part of her adult life managing pain quietly in rooms where nobody was paying attention, and she knew that healing was not a single moment, but a long series of smaller ones, some of them barely noticeable, some of them arriving unexpectedly in the middle of ordinary Tuesday afternoons. She returned to the Sicilian estate in January, not because Dante asked her to. He had offered her the Palermo apartment, the Rome house, anything she wanted, with the particular carefulness of a man who has realized that what he wants and what he deserves are currently very different things. She returned to the estate because it was where her desk was, where her files were, where 6 years of work lived in organized folders that nobody else fully understood. She returned because it was hers, regardless of everything else. Dante was already there when she arrived. He did not make grand gestures. This was the first thing she noticed, and it mattered more than she expected. She had braced herself, without quite admitting it, for the version of Dante Romano that solved problems through scale. The man who expressed everything in the currency of excess. Flowers in every room, jewelry on the breakfast table, the operatic performance of remorse that would have been, she realized, more about his own relief than her actual healing. Instead, he was simply present. He was at the estate when she arrived, and he was there the next morning and the morning after that. He began reviewing the company files himself. Actually reviewing them, sitting at the table in the study, with reading glasses she had never seen him wear before, working through documents with the focused discomfort of a man discovering how much he hadn't known about his own operation. He asked her questions, real ones that required real answers, not the performative consultations of someone seeking validation. He listened to the answers. He implemented what she suggested without repackaging it as his own idea, which was something she hadn't expected and noted without comment. The captains noticed. The household staff noticed. Marco, who had quietly adored Isabella for 6 years without ever saying so, noticed most of all and said the least. February brought a crisis in the Catania shipping operation. A legitimate one, a customs dispute that threatened to freeze 3 months of cargo. And Dante handled it by sitting across from Isabella for 4 hours while she walked him through the legal framework and the 3 available solutions and the specific pressure points that would resolve it fastest. He didn't once check his phone. At the end of 4 hours, when they had the outline of a resolution, he looked at her across the desk and said simply, "How long have you been doing this?" "Since the 2nd year of our marriage," she said. He was quiet for a long moment. "I wasted a lot of time," he said. "Yes, so did I," she said, and meant it differently than he did, which he understood, which meant something. Spring arrived slowly in Sicily, the way it always did. Tentatively at first, the olive trees making their decision before anything else, and then suddenly all at once. Isabella began a project she had been considering for 3 years. Restructuring the Romano Foundation's charitable operations, which had existed on paper for a decade and accomplished nearly nothing. She brought in 2 administrators from Palermo, rebuilt the governance structure, and redirected funding toward 3 villages in the interior that had the specific combination of need and infrastructure to actually use it. Dante attended the first board meeting. He attended the second one too. At the third, he made a suggestion that was genuinely good, and she told him so, and the look on his face, briefly, before he composed it, was something she stored carefully in the part of herself that was still deciding. The invitation arrived in April. Another gathering, smaller than Venice, less formal, but the same fundamental requirement. A dinner attended by family heads and their spouses, the kind of evening where presence and positioning communicated everything that wouldn't be said aloud. Dante received it on a Thursday morning and brought it to Isabella's study without being asked. He placed it on her desk. "I'd like you to come," he said, "if you want to." She looked at the invitation and then at him. "If I want to," she repeated. "It's your decision," he said. "Not an expectation, not a requirement." He paused. "I'm asking." She considered him for a long moment, this man who had spent 6 months proving something through the accumulated weight of ordinary days rather than a single dramatic declaration, who had come through a mountain in the dark and held her hands in the cold and said, "Tell me what is enough, and I'll do it," and then, remarkably, had actually tried. Trying was not the same as arriving. She knew that, but it was where everything real began. "I'll need 2 hours to get ready," she said. Something shifted in his face, not triumph. He was wise enough now to understand that this wasn't victory. It was a beginning, something quieter, closer to relief and gratitude living side by side. "I'll wait," he said. The dinner was held at a villa outside Florence. They arrived together. Dante Romano walked through the entrance of that villa and into a room full of people who had watched his empire nearly collapse and had drawn their own conclusions about what that meant. And he stopped inside the doorway and turned and waited. Isabella came in beside him. He took her hand, not the practiced, performative gesture of a man managing appearances. The simple, deliberate act of a man choosing, publicly, without ambiguity, in a room where every choice was observed and remembered. "Gentlemen," he said, to the room at large, to Don Cesare, who stood near the fireplace, and inclined his head with something that looked almost like satisfaction. "Most of you know my wife." A pause. "She saved my life," he said, "my empire, and something I almost didn't deserve to keep." He looked at her then, not at the room, just at her. "I intend to spend considerable time making sure she knows that." Isabella looked back at him. 6 months of ordinary mornings, reading glasses and shipping documents and board meetings, and a man learning, slowly and imperfectly, to see what had been in front of him for 6 years. It was not the marriage she had thought she was getting when she stood in a village church and said yes to Dante Romano. It was better, because it was real, built not on appearances or tradition or the performance of strength, but on the one thing that had been missing from the beginning, and was now quietly and stubbornly taking root. She let him hold her hand. And for the first time in longer than she could remember, she didn't calculate what came next. She simply stayed.